When we are not realized, when we are not supported in all that we might see and be, it atrophies. Just as if we didn't eat right or didn't get enough exercise, or, were raised horrible experiments from the 50s where animals are kept in a box and their eyes don't form. That's what we're doing to our spiritual awareness. We're locking it up in a lockbox and letting kids starve. And it is little wonder that they then have profound despair when they come of age.
Welcome to the Examined Life podcast. My name's Kenny Primrose. I'm a teacher and a writer based in the UK. And like all of us, I have a vested interest in what it means to live a good life. Each episode, I ask an influential thinker what question they think we should be asking ourselves. I've had conversations with some fascinating thinkers about embracing limitation, what it means to have a healthy relationship with pain and pleasure, and today, a discussion about human spirituality. The broadcaster and writer Krista Tippett said that there is something redemptive and life-giving about asking better questions. My hope is that the questions explored in these conversations will offer insights and perspective that can draw attention to what really matters. Have you ever had an experience that couldn't easily be rationalised or explained away? It might have been that sense that you should phone someone or speak to a stranger, and it turns out that when you do, there was a very good reason that you did, which you couldn't have foreseen. It's a kind of spooky experience. Or perhaps a sense that life is enchanted. It's alive with meaning that you can perceive and you can feel, but you can't quite grasp and articulate. If that resonates, then you might find this episode interesting. In it, Dr. Lisa Miller explains why she thinks that there's a spiritual reality to the world and that we are hardwired to perceive it as humans. Dr. Miller is not a theologian. She doesn't work for any religious organisation. She is, in fact, a professor of psychology at Columbia University in New York. Her work is grounded in scientific research, which she's written about in her books The Awakened Brain and The Spiritual Child. This conversation was such a pleasure to have. Dr. Miller is not only a compelling scholar, but she's also a warm and wonderful storyteller. In it, we discuss what it might mean to become spiritually awakened and why she believes spirituality is our birthright. She guides me through a few practices that I found really profound. You can follow along with these if you are so inclined. I do hope you enjoy listening. Please do get in touch to let me know your thoughts and share the episode if you like it. And if you haven't done so, then do please sign up for the newsletter and the mailing list at examined-life.com for updates, musings, and forthcoming interviews. Dr. Lisa Miller, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to connect with you today. You're known for your research and writing on spirituality. And I imagine that's what we're going to be talking about today. But perhaps we can begin with the opening theme of this podcast, which is to ask you what question you think we should be asking ourselves today.
So my question is really shared at the level of phenomenology, the experience in being. And I'm proposing if you and our community is aware of having the experience of being both a point and a wave, which is to say connecting into the distinct separateness in life, perhaps at the mechanistic and material level, and at the same time connecting into the unitive reality of life, the phenomenological awareness of being part of one sacred consciousness field.
A point and a wave kind of brings to mind the sea. Is that the metaphor you had in mind?
Yeah, white caps on one ocean. That there is a distinction emergent in an instant, and in its deep essence and substance, we're part of one sea of life.
It feels like a very rich metaphor. I wonder if you would be able to unpack, maybe with examples, what you mean by being a point and a wave, to help us try and understand it a bit more.
So, Kenny, I was by very, very bright, extremely well-intentioned, kind professors, and before that, K-12 teachers. In the air and water of my education, I was effectively brought into a view of the world where we are like billiard balls bouncing around, that, you're sitting there and I'm sitting here and we are different and we are separate and maybe we have a few things in common, but it was really the model of life as billiard balls. It was a notion really of radical separateness, radical materialism. We exist insofar as you can detect us, measure us, height, weight, IQ, whatever it is, measure us up. And in my path in life, at the most important moments in my life, it quickly became clear that the idea that we're billiard balls, and even ever more so that we're somehow so-called randomly bouncing into each other, that the sort of foundational tempo or nature of the universe is random. That was an assumption with which I was also raised in the air and water of my education. We randomly bump into each other's billiard balls. Sometimes good things happen, sometimes unwanted things happen. Well, that was a model of reality. And it never, as a young child, quite squared with my early, open eyed, uncensored view of life. But after a good number of years of school, I started to look through life with those goggles as well. And it was only through really life changing moments of incredible pain and despair, moments of resolution to that pain and despair, that I started seeing a model of reality that was much more consistent with the data in my life's path. So, as a scientist, it seemed to me that the notion of a random universe of billiard balls bumping around did not hold the most transformative, the biggest catches in my life of meaning and direction and significance. It just didn't hold life in its most meaningful moments. And I'll give you an example. In The Awakened Brain, I talk about my husband and I really struggling, like down on the floor, miserable, struggling for 5 years to become parents. And when I used, door number one, the model of billiard balls, I went about this through a 20th century scientist lens. I looked up all the doctors in Manhattan and then all the doctors in the northeast of the US and then all the doctors in the United States who had the highest rates of conception for couples trying to become parents. And that approach yielded nothing but despair. Concomitant with that journey, in The Awakened Brain I share, we also were having a ego death, really a death of the illusion of radical control in our lives. There's a few things we can control. I can push the elevator button, I can get in my car, but if there's traffic and if the elevator takes 10 minutes or 10 seconds, we don't control 90% of life. And that other 90% started to show itself as a pathway, really more than a pathway, more really, I would say, rolling out the red carpet in direction to actually becoming parents. That was the ultimate journey. Shall I share a bit of that?
That would be lovely if you don't mind.
Great. Okay. Well, okay. In our journey, I was young. I was only about 30, 31. And it had never dawned on me. We'd been married for about 5 years. We were married young, that naturally we'd be parents. We had the jobs we wanted. He was a lawyer. I was an academic. That's what we'd always wanted. We were living where we wanted in a city with nice friends, and everything was great until suddenly I started getting this horrible feeling, what if we can't get pregnant? So, we went off on a vacation. We went to the Caribbean. That's where people go to start families. And we came back thinking, oh, any day now we'll know the good news. And it was not good news, not at all. So we said, well, who gets one for one? And instead we went off to the Southwest. We went to Sedona, which had good energy. And we thought, oh, we'll get pregnant in Sedona. Came back. And again, it was not good news. And after about 6 months, I got this haunting feeling that something was wrong. And after a year, I said, we're delusional to think there's not an impasse here. So our greatest horror, got everything else we wanted. Well, the only thing that felt like it actually mattered at all to us was that we wanted to become parents, and it wasn't happening. So I looked up all the best fertility clinics possible. And I went to the first one, and I actually have to confess, I felt even a little bit high on my horse. I'm so young, I can still get pregnant. And I went in and they said, oh, there's nothing physically wrong. And we went through the procedures, no baby. We went through ramped up more procedures, no baby. And with in vitro, it's a pretty intense, invasive procedure. When it doesn't take, and that tiny little embryo that was there is now dead, it starts to feel like a funeral. It feels really depressing. So much so that my husband, I literally woke up one night and he wasn't in bed. I thought, well, where could he be? And then I worried what's happened to him. He was down on the floor, Kenny. He was literally on the floor, flat on his back. This is a Manhattan lawyer in his mid-30s. And he says, our lives are completely hollow and meaningless without children. Everything is for nothing. He was really depressed. And that's exactly how I felt. Well, right around this time of real despair, people started showing up in our lives in a way that was far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance. For instance, I just had a horrifically depressing failed in vitro. My husband was depressed. I was depressed. I had to go to work nonetheless. So I hop on the bus to go up Broadway to Columbia. The bus is empty because I've gone in late because I'm depressed, 10:30. And the gentleman gets on the bus, who was a quite unique gentleman. And I was so depressed, I thought, oh no, he's not. He was walking towards me. And normally I try to be welcoming and gracious to people, but I just did not have it in me. And I saw this man get closer and closer. And I thought, no, he's not. And he sits down right next to me on the empty bus and turns to me. And he says, you know what, lady? You look like just that type of woman that would go all around the world adopting children. Okay. That is not a random universe. I would not be a scientist by any measure if I threw out the outlier. Right? That was far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance. It never happened in the years before. It never happened in the years since. And like all profound synchronicities, it starts with a little bit of annoyance. Let me be in my funk and you're not who I'd planned to see today. No, don't sit by me. And it is, in fact, a meaningful guide. Synchronicity is our greatest gift to open up a new door because it feels not as we've planned, because it is a kerfuffling of what the ego had planned for the day. So synchronicity really upends the ego, and that's part of its power.
Thank you so much for sharing from your own experience there, Lisa. Really beautiful story. Would it be fair to say that this experience, this encounter, kind of challenged your experience of living in a materialistic, disinterested universe, and that part of that was that this universe has, something personal to say to you? Is that
yes, fair? And it's not just me. I'm not special. I'm an emanation like everybody else from someone who is very special. Source. My word is God, the universe. But this isn't just for a few of us. Every one of us is part of this symphony, and we're showing up for one another. Sometimes we know it. Sometimes we don't even know how much we've helped each other. But in this symphony, let's tell it from the other side. Kenny, can you think of a time where you've just felt like you've got to say something to someone? I mean, you don't know why, but it's on the tip of your tongue, and maybe you do say it, and it's remarkable how much it affects the recipient.
I have had exactly that experience. So people saying things to me that have resonated in a kind of uncanny way, or me feeling kind of prompted to say something to someone. And I don't quite know why. I don't know the rationale behind it. And it comes across like a gift.
Yes, it's a gift.
And it comes from somewhere else, outside of me.
Yes, and what kind of somewhere else? It's not anything bigger. It's something loving and guiding. Loving, holding, and guiding, directing. So, I think we are messengers for one another. That relational spirituality, of course, has to do with our direct relationship to who I call God, source, the universe, spirit. But it also has to do with the presence of the greatest force in our love for one another. In all different types of love, like collegial love and parental love and romantic love. But in our love for one another is the presence of this great guiding force. So when we feel, just say it, by all means, that is the most precious gift you can give someone. Do you want to share a story, or also share a story of that?
Well, if you have one coming to mind, Lisa, I'd love to hear more of your stories. They're fascinating.
Well, okay, so I'm standing in line at the health food store. And in front of me, I always sort of peek into the next person's basket. I'm interested. I need ideas. So, I see the fresh kale and I see the, coconut milk. And I look at her and something says to me deep inside, I am compelled, tell her how healthy she looks. And so I respected that urge that felt to come from deep within, which is to say, in us, through us, and around us source. And I turned to her and I said, I just have to tell you how healthy you look. And she bursts out crying. And she says, I can't believe it. And she leans forward and very quietly, she says, yesterday I started chemotherapy. And I said, well, so, you are healthy and you're taking the cancer out. And she said, yes, thank you.
So did this happen a little bit further down the line, Lisa, when you learn to kind of tune in to those impulses or that kind of attention? And if so, is that something you think you exercise, that you can become better at keying into?
Yes. In us, through us, and around us. Elsewhere, meaning it was not from the level of ego, what I call, our achieving awareness, planned, tactically, strategically. It came from a dialogue with spirit, a dialogue with life. Achieving awareness is going about things as we've planned and thinking that we're masters of the universe. And like I said, pushing the elevator button, we can do that. But whether the elevator comes, that has nothing to do with us. And so the 90% of life that's not controllable, such as 3 years of a pandemic, such as a 52 card pickup of our global post-industrial culture. See, this is synchronicity. Kenny, can you hear it right as we talk about what we don't control? In my office at Columbia, there's a kicking and a racket. You hear it?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Point emphasized. So in the 90% of life that is flux and dynamic, we can hold a different conversation with life that is far more buoyant and effective, which is, wow, what is life showing me now? What is the deepest nature of life showing me now? And how might I live in dialogue so that, it's just like a lover. You don't control a lover. You want to get to know him or her. Like, how, if you love life, do you want to know life or do you want to stomp upon life and hold the reins tight and make it do what you think you want?
You put it quite beautifully at the end of your book. You wrote that we rise from the narrows of splintered self-interest, isolation and competition and awaken our hearts to the world as it is. Speaking, of course, here about being spiritually awakened. But I'm interested in how you made this argument to your academic colleagues at Columbia and beyond. Spirituality seems so often to be dismissed as being a bit woo-woo or lacking in empirical evidence. So how did it go down when you decided to take seriously this field of spirituality as an academic?
There were two things that I really propelled this journey, despite the fact that 90% of people were naysayers. The first is that it felt that the fact that no one else was even willing to entertain the possibility meant that the work needed to be done. So it didn't mean it was wrong. It was being dismissed out of hand. I hadn't heard a single shred of evidence to support the notion of a random universe or anything like that. So the sort of mass denial or vogue to turn the head towards radical materialism, I took as a sign that the work needed to be done. The second piece was that I was finding in my own journey a profound authorization of other ways of knowing. And these weren't other ways of knowing that Dr. Miller made up in 2 years. These were other ways of knowing that our rich human heritage has carried forward for thousands of years, much of which seems to have been inspired information. So, at the inner table of human knowing, I had a very well built up empiricist and logician, as many of us do from mainstream education. But also at that table, in our birthright, deserving to be, right there is the mystic and the intuitive and, the skeptic, right? And everyone can work together, multiple forms of knowing, multiple forms of perception, which I have come to see as multiple forms of perceiving layers of reality. Now, that to me was so important because it hurts too much to not live out fully our nature. It hurts as a way of kicking us. It's an existential pang. It's a spiritual hunger kicking us to open up and realize our full being. That we are in fact mystics, every one of us, not just the most pious or the longest in meditation. Every one of us is built with an innate capacity for transcendent awareness. I mean, now, 20 years down the pike, I can show you our published MRI studies in top peer-reviewed journals that show we are all built with a neuroseat of transcendent awareness through which we perceive a transcendent relationship and that presence and our love for one another. But back then, before we had access to MRI studies and before we knew what to ask, I was looking through the lens of epidemiology, and I could see in very same data sets that everybody else used, nationally representative data sets, measuring depression and despair and addiction, big one, in the same way every other scientist did, that the only factor amongst everything in the clinical or social sciences that really protects against addiction, that really mitigates despair, is spiritual awareness, a strong spiritual core. By what, 80% protective? That's, you never hear that. If something's 20% protective, it's you buy it in a pill at the pharmacy. 80% protective, a strong spiritual life is 80% protective against addiction, then it seems to me that the mass epidemic of addiction is because we haven't realized our spiritual nature. You can't locate that in an individual. When half of Gen Z is depressed or addicted, that's not an individual's stumbling block. That is a mass cultural indoctrination out of our birthright, our spiritual core.
The statistics you draw on are absolutely staggering, which is no doubt why the Pentagon employed you to work with them on developing resilience through spirituality. The fact that we are educated out of spirituality by our cultural stories suggests that we would see spirituality really clearly in young children. Is that something that you have found to be the case?
Kenny, 100%. 100%. I can say that both as a scientist and as a parent who's raised 3 children. And I'll give you an example. The first important piece of data is that if you look at twin studies, you can determine the extent to which any human capacity is inborn versus taught. Okay. So the gift of religion is 100% environmentally transmitted. It is taught by our parents or grandparents. It's given by the community. Religion is a environmentally transmitted gift. Spirituality and the deep capacity to perceive that we are whitecaps on one ocean, that we're all emanations of one sun, one source, that we show up for each other in divine appointment. Spirituality, the capacity to perceive our spiritual nature and who we are to one another, that is 1/3 innate. That means it is hardwired. Every one of us is born with a neuroseat of spiritual awareness. Now, let me compare that. Temperament, whether or not we're laid back or high strung, whether we're introverted, extroverted, temperament's half innate, half environmentally formed. IQ is 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. So 1/3 innate, our spiritual capacity, means that it is our birthright, but 2/3 environmentally formed means that how we are raised, our culture, the air and water of our culture, the air and water of the silent curriculum, the pedagogical, deeply molding forces of K-12 and university all weigh in to shape our natural spiritual core. So when we are not realized, when we are not supported in all that we might see and be, it atrophies. Just as if we didn't eat right or didn't get enough exercise or, were raised horrible experiments from the 50s where animals are kept in a box and their eyes don't form. That's what we're doing to our spiritual awareness. We're locking it up in a lockbox and letting kids starve. And it is little wonder that they then have profound despair when they come of age. That's the first piece of data. The second piece of data on the child is that, and I go into this in The Awakened Brain, also in The Spiritual Child, my first book, when you listen to young children, they express what psychologists call implicit spiritual cognition. A religious person might call that the natural soul, but whatever one's lens or, lexicon. The child, unless socialized out of it, will perceive continuity of consciousness or spirit after death, that we go on and will spontaneously speak in that way. The child, unless socialized out of it, will perceive that we can simply know that we have, I would say we have direct access to the consciousness field in us, through us, and around us. We can directly know without being told. And I'll give you examples of both. My oldest child, Isaiah, I share in the Awakened Brain. I was so grateful and blessed to adopt from an orphanage north of St. Petersburg, Russia. And when he came home, he was already in a direct connection to spirit, to God. He would yell out the door, up at the stars, "Thank you, God." I mean, I didn't teach him to yell up at the stars. "Thank you, God," full of love. And, we went to the beach once, and a, highly acculturated Western child saw that Isaiah had his one treasured toy, the only toy he'd had the week he came home, which was a rinsed out cottage cheese container. And the other little boy snatched it. And Isaiah didn't look angry. He looked puzzled, because he hadn't been raised with hard boundaries, so-called property, atomism, separateness, right? So he was born sharing, generous. Another example, the week that our great-grandfather died, Pop, were Jews, and Isaiah was sitting, as Jews do, right graveside by the open hole in the earth. And what in our tradition we do is we literally take a shovel, Kenny, and put earth on the casket, because then body, mind, and soul, we get the picture that the person has crossed. Isaiah, being so little, was given little tiny, barely two, a garden spade. And he put a little tiny bit of earth, and he looked at me, having done something for his pop, helped bury him. He said, "Look, Mama, the body goes back to the good earth. The soul goes to God." I hadn't taught him that. He knew it. Continuity of consciousness. A week later, we're in the backyard of our garden. "Mommy, come here now." So we come. "You see, Mommy?" And there's a dead turkey flat on its back. The body goes back to the good earth. The soul goes to God. And his eyes sparkled. He wasn't traumatized. He felt connected to the continuity of spirit, consciousness, and the glorious sort of spiritual nature of reality. He'd figured that all out on his own. What I can do as a parent is not ruin it for him. I can say, "Wow, yes, how wonderful." If I don't have anything to say about cosmology, I can honor his direct knowing. And it's profoundly important, because he then knows he's a direct knower. Those are examples of the young child. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing those beautiful stories. I wonder if I can ask you a question about a friend of mine who I was chatting to last night. I was telling him that I was going to be having this conversation, and he would like to think like you think, like I think, that there is a spiritual reality to the world and to us as humans. Though for him, it's a materialist universe. It's billiard balls. So I guess my question is, where would you start? Like, how would you try to draw attention to the spiritual nature of reality to someone who just kind of can't will themselves to believe it? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, and I think it's very important, because every one of us is built with the neuroseat of awakened awareness, but we need to, 2/3 environmentally formed. As we get older, we choose how we practice our life. We choose our environment, both externally with whom we spend time, but also internally, what we regard and take as real within our inner experience. So I'd invite your friend to an experiment, perhaps invoke his curiosity, and also allow him the opportunity. I allow you, you allow yourself to authorize inner knowing as hard data. Because what I would say, was the purely accidental perniciousness in post-industrial education, was the deauthorizing of inner knowing, that our deep inner wisdom, the intuitive catch, that high pixel knowing that we get, is somehow discounted. How do you know that? Where in the back of history, where from everything from today backwards was that derived? No, this high pixel catch, this intuition, this mystical opening, it's high pixel information that it will unfold. It carries future information. So the proof is in the pudding. But there is an exercise I do with my students at Columbia. Would you allow me just for a couple of minutes? Great. Well, so at Columbia, my classes are the Spirituality Mind Body Institute. Every class is foundationally based in spirituality. And as we're doing now, Kenny, we wed our experience with science and listen to each other as trail angels. We're all here in a journey. I call it a journey group. So I'm going to share with you a core practice that we do, if I might. I'm going to invite you to take 5 breaths, clear out your inner space.
Okay.
I invite you to think of a time where you wanted something so much. You really wanted it bad. I mean, and you got ready for it. That red door, it could have been a job. It could have been a promotion, maybe for he or she to say yes, to go out. It might have been admission to a school. There was something you wanted, and you did everything right to get there. You did A plus B plus C. Researched it tactically, strategically. You were right. And as you went for that red door, it was stuck. And you couldn't believe it because you'd done everything right. In terms of your achieving mind, you'd set it up, but the red door was stuck. And only because it was stuck, you had no choice. It might have been infuriating and time maybe depressing. You turned. And you turned. You had no choice. Maybe 35 degrees, 50, 120 degrees. And over there was a wide open, sparkling yellow door. You might have said that yellow doors didn't exist. You'd never thought of them or heard of them. But on the other side of this yellow door was someone more right for you that made you feel alive in a way you'd never felt before, or a job that built up a real strength that had laid dormant, and you found yourself quite at home and accelerating. Anyway, that yellow door has everything to do with who you are and where you are today. And as you now look at that stuck red door and the hairpin turn you took to the yellow door, was there anyone at that hairpin turn who said something, who told you a story, who gave you information? It could have been someone you met for 5 minutes at the coffee shop or on the bus. It could have been someone like a best friend or a grandparent who for the first time told you this story. But that trail angel had much to do with turning to see the yellow door. And as you sit back looking at the stuck red door, the hairpin turn, the trail angel, and the wide open yellow door, how in your lived path have the biggest, most important parts of your life come into being? And even more so, are we makers of our path, or despite all of our, and we do need this, tactics and strategy and preparation, we need that, is the ultimate opportunity not that we are a maker of our path, but that we are discoverers of our journey. And as discoverers of our journey, with whom are we in dialogue? When you sit way back, finally, stuck red door, hairpin turn, trail angel, wide open yellow door, where is your higher power? Where is the force in and through life, who I call God? Is this presence in the stuck red door necessary for the open yellow door? Is it in the trail angel? In your capacity to be in dialogue with what is life showing me now? And I wonder then, is it possible that all along you have been listening to life, and that you might just evermore prosper in walking your path through awareness of this great dialogue?
What a beautiful exercise to do with your students. I would love to witness that. And I think I need to think through it again with a pen and paper in hand.
I think the point is that we're all naturally awakened beings to some extent, because this is our birthright. We have all used this. And the proof is in the pudding. If we can locate the time where we actually have used our awakened brain, have engaged in this unitive awareness, that the trail angel is saying this now. They didn't say it once for the past 10 years, nor have they in the 5 years since. Why today? The outlier is where the synchronicity lives, and the synchronicity opens the door to our true spiritual journey.
Something that comes to mind, Lisa, is personality traits. So from what I understand, personality traits, at least the big five, are relatively fixed. And I'm wondering whether there's a correlation between openness, how open you are to experience, and how spiritually aware you are. Is there a correlation you can speak into there?
So, Kenny, you should come teach for us because you really understand the awakened brain and its keen research-based detail. Yes, you nailed it. Our capacity for awakened awareness exists independent of almost all personality structures. So whether I'm introverted or extroverted, I can be equally spiritual. It just is expressed differently, right? Who was Martin Luther King? He was extroverted and introverted, really. Gandhi, extroverted and introverted. So our personality exists as a separate construct, whether we're, high strung or laid back, except one exception for the capacity to be open to experience. And here is where our artists, our musicians, our writers, our thinkers, our composers are porous, right? Our creatives are porous, whether they're poets or musicians or scientists, open to experience. And when we're open to experience, more gets in, more delight, more enthusiasm, but also more pain. And it potentiates our spiritual growth because we bear witness times 10. Bearing witness is a form of spiritual awakening. Now, every person, nobody gets out of this, has a process of hardwired spiritual awakening. It accelerates for the first time in middle adolescence to late adolescence to emerging adulthood. There's a growth spurt, right as we start to fill out and look like adults, look different physically, so too we are growing, having a growth spurt spiritually. And this process, we see it through science, through a 50% increase in the heritable contribution, which means hardwired biological clock. And we are highly sensitive to the 2/3 embrace in this moment of spiritual formation. Well, when we are porous, this is augmented 10 times fold, but every single one of us will feel this growth spurt as a half empty glass of spirituality at times, more capacity. Oh, then what is my purpose? The spiritual hunger for transcendence and the numinous and to connect in an authentic way. We must have this. And this existential quest, and it is a quest, is the most important journey of our lives. It's what all literature around the questing young adult actually hinges on. And unfortunately, our society is pretty silent on this, but it is the building block of the rest of our life. Well, this is a developmental depression. It's not psychopathology in the classic sense. It needs to be regarded. And this capacity to seek, we are best at as emerging adults. We can't stand hypocrisy. Why is it at our house of worship that they don't have the teachers by the front door on the important days? They have the people who've given money. That's hypocritical, right? We can't stand hypocrisy. And we love truth. We love authentic people. We love when people tell us their most precious stories, which is inspiration. So my point is that openness to experience augments this ever more so, but we all must go through a developmental depression. And when we do, if we say yes to it, what's on the other side is, hey, what is life showing me now? What is the sort of ultimate nature of reality about? Is it really about nihilism, like everything I read in philosophy? Or does my intuitive, does my mystic, does my valid knowing of the heart say that there is more to life than billiard balls? Does my inner wisdom, my awakened awareness show me, proof in the pudding, that when I do think that this synchronicity is a knock at the door and I say, wow, Kenny, I'm so glad that today you could talk so that now we could share this, the world opens up for us and others. It's a spiritual symphony.
I can definitely resonate with what you're saying there, Lisa. no matter how kind of rationalistic and achieving mind someone might be, when you get onto this topic of spirituality and the sacred and what lies beneath, something seems to wake up in them and they will pin you to the
Yes.
wall.
It's a quarter inch under the surface. That's why it wakes up, because it's already our birthright. And it's just now given permission. And what might it sound like? And what might it look like? And Kenny, as you live authentically and express your own natural awakened voice, others are resonant and wake up and feel free to do the same. And it's enlivening. It is the greatest form of life.
So in thinking kind of practically about institutions and there's places that shape and form us and their habits and routines, what kind of practical suggestions and advice do you have? I think I remember in the Awakened Brain you suggesting that mentors ask those in their charge, in appraisal meetings, how their spiritual life is.
They now do that in the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army took the Awakened Brain science and now changed basic training. Your soldier, how's your spiritual core? In a way that is inclusive and pluralistic and authorizes the deep knowing, the awakened awareness of that soldier in his or her own voice. We threw all spiritual talk out of the public square 40 years ago, and we are a non-conversant spiritual society. And yet our birthright is so primed and ready to go that the moment we say, yes, we talk about that here, people know exactly of what we speak. It takes very little practice. It might feel awkward for a day and a half, and then they're in full bloom. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of some of these high-profile individuals who've turned to the spiritual side, but they've become, maybe in your language, spiritually awakened. Like David Brooks, the New York Times writer, a few years ago, started using spiritual language, language of the soul, and people keyed into it. They switched onto it. It was as if it was a language that was kind of dimly forgotten to them.
Life is so much bigger and exciting. It doesn't mean that everything always feels good. It can be painful and it can be joyful. But our lives are so much bigger. I mean, it's sort of like going from black and white to color on TV. Everything is alive. And who you meet, I mean, Kenny, I got to meet you today, and what is discovered, and the whole world opens up when we say synchronicity is real. Mystical experience is real. I share in the Awakened Brain mystical experiences that guided our path and opened our spiritual hearts. I mean, who would want to give up the 98% of living that is so profound and exciting and sacred? And bottom line, sacred. It's a sacred world out there.
I guess I have one final question that I'd love your perspective on, Lisa. So as you've said, our spiritual language and discourse is something that we've lost. It no longer seems to have the currency it does. And we have a world of pluralism and competing truth claims and a kind of dominant narrative of secularism. So how into this brew do you keep everybody in the room? Do you stop people switching off or feeling alienated and wake up the spiritual in them?
So may I share two thoughts? The first is that because we threw all religion out of the public square, say 40, 50 years ago, post-industrial global culture, whether it's UK, Germany, US, Canada, we became a spiritually non-conversant society. And so we awkwardly don't even know what to call certain experiences or how to respect or even ask to hear or want to hear others. But the moment we do, people connect with an enormous joy and intimacy, and their eyes light up because we can become spiritually multilingual. In the attempt, and see, it's urgent, in the attempt to be inclusive and throw religion out of the public square, we actually were radically exclusive of every faith tradition and people who are spiritual and not religious and humanists and everybody else. Can we invite people back in to speak from the universal spiritual heart in the language, in the first person of their own spiritual experience, which may or may not include the 2/3 of a religious embrace, the 2/3 that's molded by one's environment? Well, in my class at Columbia, we do this. One woman will say, when I came of age, became fertile, my grandma, she tattooed me. And it linked me to my mother and my mother's mother and my mother's mother's mother. And the next says, yeah, I got that. Because your grandma is who you're talking about. My grandma, she taught me to pray. And when I think of God, it's sort of God and my grandma all rolled up into one. And someone else says, yeah, I got that because my grandma, she's passed, but she walks with me. And when my back's against the wall, I can hear my grandma in my mind's eye. And then someone else says, yeah, I don't know about my family faith tradition, but I know that energy can never be destroyed. So, yeah, that's your grandma. And they look at each other like, I know you in the deepest way. And when class ends, they don't get up and leave the room. They're still connected. They don't want to leave because that's that sweet taste of who we can be to each other. So that's the rich embrace of pluralism, where in the first person, we speak from our spiritual heart. And I want to hear about Diwali. And can I tell you about Hanukkah? And, I want to know you. The other thing is that because this is a hardwired innate capacity, our awakened awareness is our birthright. We have developed ways in the language of life of strengthening through the Spirituality and Mind Body Institute, strengthening spiritual and awakened awareness. So may I do a 90-second practice with you?
Please do. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Kenny. I love that you're sharing the journey and open to practices. It's beautiful. Okay, I'm going to invite you to take 5 breaths and clear out your inner space. I invite you to set before you a table in your inner chamber. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything that you've done or not done, what you may have or not have, your true, eternal, higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know, whatever your word is, your higher power. And ask your higher power if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting there right now, what do they need to share? What do they need to tell you now? What do you need to know?
Thank you, Lisa. I found that a very affecting and, in fact, a surprising exercise. I think it's something I will return to.
I'm grateful. This is our birthright. This is our natural awakened awareness. This is our birthright. No one can ever take that away from you. No degree of trauma, no degree of false messengers within or without a faith tradition, a school, a family. That is yours. It cannot be taken away forever. That is your natural seed of transcendent awareness.
That exercise, whenever you've done it with whoever, has it always been positive?
Always, always.
It's amazing, really, that that's the case, because you seem to kind of open your mind to the darker recesses of it. And I suppose if people are doing this with traumatic past, it's extraordinary that this exercise is always positive.
That was a practice I had wanted so much for years in the work here at Columbia, to have a practice to help people immediately connect to what we now know as our birthright, our awakened awareness. And that was a gift. I always want to thank my teacher, and that was a gift from the late Dr. Gary Weaver. And I've done that practice, Kenny, with Midtown bankers and lawyers, homeless kids under the Brooklyn Bridge, the U.S. Army. Thousands of people have done it. Students, everyone's done. No one has ever objected. That is in the language of life. This is who we are, and it only good comes in because we're not handing it over to just anything bigger. when we hand it over, as the 12-step programs know so well, we hand it over to the deepest nature of life that is loving, guiding, and holding, who I call God. But when we hand it over, we're handing it over to the higher power that's loving, holding, and guiding. There, always, always.
Like you said, Lisa, we've kind of banished religion and talk of the spiritual from the town square, and we no longer have a language for it. We're so impoverished in that way because language obviously forms the way we think. It brings to mind, these two words in French for knowledge, connaître and savoir. The savoir being the kind of propositional knowledge, and connaître being knowledge through experience. It seems like we only really talk about knowledge as propositions rather than knowing through experience, which is something that forms us and shapes us.
That's so wise. And yet we sense in our history, to be savvy does not ring of soulfulness, right? But to be cognizant, to knowing it's a different parallel perhaps, but I think you're opening a door that says this actually has always been our birthright. We knew this for thousands of years. And there was a scary ice age, radical materialism, radical splintered identity, radical separateness in the 20th century. And the pain in our culture most acutely in the spiritually emerging young adults is the hunt, the spiritual hunger to renew our whole being, to recapture our natural awakened awareness. Our soul is at the center of who we are.
Well, Lisa, that feels like a really beautiful thought to end on. I'm so grateful for you giving up your time this morning in New York time. It's been wonderful to converse with you.
It's such a joy, Kenny, to connect with you, fellow sojourner.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on and discussing this question of when we've been a point in a wave and opening us up to new stories of what it means, I think, to be a human and to be part of a bigger story.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this conversation with Dr. Lisa Miller. If you're interested in her work and her research, then drlisamillerphd.com is a good place to start, as is her TED Talk available online and her books, The Spiritual Child and The Awakened Brain. I'm very grateful to Lisa for being so generous with her time and her thoughts. And also to my bro Colin for any background music you heard. And of course to you for listening. Spirituality is something of a Marmite topic. You either love it, like me, I like talking about such things, or it maybe turns you off. But I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts regardless. Please do like and share the episode if indeed you did like it. And tune in for the next episode, which is going to be with Professor Tim Ingold, an anthropologist who is fascinating, was a joy to speak to about sustainability versus progress, the problems with our education system, and why we need to listen to ancestral wisdom.